Being an underdog isn't easy, but for these fighters, they were almost brought into a matchup specifically so they would lose. However, when all was said and done, these so-called sacrificial lambs ended up getting their hand raised, sometimes in the most shocking of fashions. This video is about those fighters who flipped the script. Now, without further ado, and ranked in no particular order, here are 10 sacrificial lambs that actually won in MMA. Number 10. Forrest Griffin versus Shogun Rua. Some of the greatest fighters in UFC history made their initial splash in the MMA world over in Pride. And when Shogun Rua, someone who won the 2005 Pride Middleweight Grand Prix, entered the UFC on a 4-fight win streak, it was clear that he was headed straight for the top of the 205-pound division. Fresh off a first-round knockout at heavyweight against Alistair Overeem, Shogun was brought in with a matchup against Forrest Griffin. A good fighter, an icon of the sport even, but not a guy who seemed like he would be any match for the Pride legend.
People respect Shogun enough to say that he is the #1 fighter in the world.
I just want to fight the dude. I've always liked the way he fought. What's wrong with fighting the best, right?
So when Forrest turned around and beat up Shogun before tapping him out in the final seconds of round 3, a new contender was born. And sure enough, he actually went on to upset Quentin Rampage Jackson for the undisputed light heavyweight title in his next fight, a true underdog story. Number 9. Tito Ortiz versus Ryan Bader. By the time Tito Ortiz was matched up against the rising talent that was Ryan Bader, he was far removed from the champion who dominated the 205-pound division all those years before. Tito Ortiz hadn't won a fight in 5 years, and the younger, more athletic Bader was expected to make a real statement on fight night.
Dana puts me against guys who are the top guys, top tier guys. Use me as, to step them up is fine. I'm supposed to lose.
Ortiz was fighting with the intensity of a man who was about to lose his place in the UFC, though. And in one of the earliest exchanges, he dropped Bader with a punch, locking up the fight-ending guillotine choke before 2 minutes had even passed.
That's a solid guillotine, Mike. That is deep. Trying to choke the over. What a huge victory for Tito Ortiz.
Not only was this one of the biggest upsets of the year, it was also one of the biggest upsets of all time.
Dana told me that my back is against the wall and I fight the best when my back against the wall. And yes, my back was pressed against the cage as hard as possible, and I had to win,
Number 8. Seth Petrozelli versus Kimbo Slice. Back in 2008, Kimbo Slice was originally supposed to take on Ken Shamrock at Elite XC, but when the UFC pioneer suffered a cut during his pre-fight training, a 205-pounder from the prelims, Seth Petrozelli was given the call-up. Despite being 30 pounds lighter than Kimbo and stepping in on just hours' notice, Seth Petrozelli managed to score a knockout in just 14 seconds, a massive upset at the time.
Slice goes down. Slice in trouble. Oh my goodness. Slice gets pounded out.
Kimbo Slice was so heavily connected to the health of Elite XC's brand that this defeat in many ways contributed to the promotion's eventual downfall. That and the fact that they allegedly tried to pay Petrozelli off to keep the fight standing, that one certainly backfired.
What happened? Seth Petrozelli knocked you out in 14 seconds.
I wasn't there mentally. I could beat this dude, you know what I'm saying? I could smash this dude, with one hand probably tied behind my back, but that night I just was not there mentally.
Number 7. Roxanne Modafferi versus Macy Barber. At one point, Macy Barber was convinced that she was destined to break John Jones's record and become the youngest champion in UFC history.
You have a goal to be the youngest UFC champion.
Every interview that I've done has been on that topic. I'm excited for that because it's something that's going to happen.
And after winning by TKO in her spot on the Contender Series, Barber lived up to the hype with 3 straight stoppages to open her UFC account. So when the UFC tried to give her the next logical step and set up a fight with the veteran Roxanne Modafferi, how were we supposed to know that an almighty shock was coming? Well, on fight night, Roxanne turned up in a big way, using her veteran savvy to put on a surprisingly dominant performance. Barber, it seems, had injured herself mid-fight, and when the bout was finished, Macy and her team did themselves no favors with their rampant excuse-making. But for Modafferi, this was one hell of a return to form.
I was a little surprised at how much of an underdog I was. I'm always the underdog, that's fine. But I told all my friends to just bet on me, and they're pretty happy right now, I'm pretty sure.
Number 6. Joe Lauzon versus Melvin Guillard. It might seem like an eternity ago now, but there was a time when Melvin Guillard was seen as a pretty outstanding prospect within the UFC's lightweight division. Sure, he had some mixed success early on, but between 2010 and 2011, he put together a 5-fight streak, which included 3 first-round knockouts. In truth, he was looking like a serious potential contender for the lightweight title.
I am the best 155er. I'm a finisher, and I'm gonna just keep knocking guys out until I get a title shot, and nobody's gonna beat me. I will be number one, I promise.
So the UFC decided to give him a pay-per-view main card opportunity against the unheralded Joe Lauzon, a guy who had been posting wins and losses in equal measure, and entered the fight as a pretty massive underdog.
You know, you coming in as a huge underdog. It's 3-2-1.
I don't mind being the underdog. Takes all the pressure off me. I think he's got the utmost confidence in himself, you know, but confidence alone doesn't win fights.
But in the earliest stages, Lauzon landed big, dropping Melvin to the canvas before locking up the fight-ending rear naked choke.
Did he do it? Look at that choke him out! That's it! It's all over! It is all over! Unbelievable! Off the upset!
This was a major shock, and little did we know, one of the most exciting fighters of his era had just officially come onto the scene.
I definitely think he was overlooking the whole entire thing. He was definitely looking past me. You know, but I like being in that position.
Number 5, Nate Diaz versus Conor McGregor. Nate Diaz was once famously described by Dana White as a guy who is simply not a needle mover.
And the unfortunate part is he's not a needle mover. His brother is a needle mover. He's not.
Well, there are very few quotes in MMA history that have aged as badly as that one. Jump forward to 2016's short-notice matchup between Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor, and the world was about to get a major lesson on counting out an underdog.
I'm a lion in there, and I'm going to eat you alive. Your little gazelle friends are going to be staring through the cage, looking at you, getting your carcass getting eaten alive, and they can do nothing.
Conor had all the momentum coming into the fight, but all of a sudden, he was stepping in there with a guy who was much bigger and far more durable than any of the featherweights he had previously beat. And when Nate didn't go down to his biggest punches, Conor started to fatigue, and fatigue fast. In round 2, all of a sudden, Nate had all of the momentum, and after forcing the Irishman to shoot in for a takedown, he locked up a fight-ending but also life-changing rear naked choke.
Conor's in serious trouble. He's got him flattened out. That's it. He's got the choke. Nate Diaz. He's done it.
And with that, a new star was born. Number 4, Junior Dos Santos versus Fabricio Verdum. Debut assignments don't come much tougher than Fabricio Verdum, but when Junior Dos Santos first touched down in the UFC, they kinda threw him to the sharks. Or, to be more clear, the UFC threw Verdum directly into the path of this future champion. But we didn't know, at least at the time, that we were looking at an icon in the making. So when JDS came into the UFC and KO'd the great Verdum in 80 seconds,
then 238.
it really did send a message. Fabricio was seen as one of the greatest BJJ to MMA transitioners to ever do it. But by the time Dos Santos was through with him, it was clear that the division had a new knockout artist on their hands. In fact, his first 5 UFC outings would all be finished by knockout, with only Mirko Cro Cop making it out of the first round. Number 3, Gabriel Gonzaga versus Mirko Cro Cop. There's nothing quite like a taste of your own medicine. And while most people were desperately hoping to see a prime version of Mirko Cro Cop do great work in the UFC, his time in the US actually left a lot to be desired. In fact, the most famous UFC highlight involving this legendary kickboxer wasn't even one of his own wins. Facing off against Gabriel Gonzaga, any fans hoping to see a vintage Cro Cop head kick were probably shocked to witness Gonzaga nailing Mirko with his own technique.
Mirko looks tentative though. Oh!
Seriously, this would have been an amazingly brutal KO without any of the context. But knowing what we know about Cro Cop, yeah, this was an all-timer. Number 2, Antonio Silva versus Alistair Overeem. Overlooking your opponent can often be a recipe for disaster. But coming off of his monumental debut against Brock Lesnar, Alistair Overeem had every right to be confident in his abilities. So when the UFC opted to set him up for a bout against Antonio Bigfoot Silva, why would the great and destructive Overeem be anything other than extremely confident?
I know I'm a better fighter. Fight will probably end in 1 or 2 rounds. I'm going to raise my hands after, and he's just going to be a number on my list. I have no words for him. I'm just going to beat him up Saturday, and let that be the end of that.
Well, as it turned out, the Reem's confidence had placed an almighty chip on Silva's shoulder, and when the fight came, he fought as if his life depended on it. And in the 3rd round, one of the earliest exchanges saw Bigfoot break through.
And now Silva starting to tear up. He rocked him. Big uppercut. This is a championship fight. It is unbelievable. Bigfoot finishes Overeem.
In that moment, he had his redemption. And boy, did he make Alistair Overeem aware of it.
What did you say to Alistair after the knockout?
Get up. I want to fight. Get up. I want to fight.
The lesson? Don't overlook your opponents, as you never know who you'll give some extra motivation to.
All the time when I'm an underdog, it's a big motivation for me.
Number 1. Bryan Barberena versus Sage Northcutt. The mismanagement of Sage Northcutt's career was truly something to behold. Not only did the UFC rush into signing this guy when he was far from old enough, but then they did their best to escalate his level of competition. After going 2-0 in the promotion, Sage was given a matchup against Bryan Barberena, a guy who is very familiar to the fans now for his entertaining fighting style. But at the time, many frankly didn't know who the hell this guy was, or what he was capable of. So, naturally, the UFC thought he'd be a good stepping stone for the rising Sage Northcutt. But after just 8 minutes of action, Barberena had found the arm triangle for the upset, shocking the world and putting any major plans for this 19-year-old prospect to bed. Northcutt actually did end his UFC run on a 3-fight win streak, but even then, it was clear that Dana White and his team didn't do his potential justice. As always, if you guys enjoyed the video, please be sure to let me know by leaving a like and subscribing to our channel. Apart from that, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.